what I'm trying to do with the course page is it'll be a little bit more detailed so that if you are viewing something after the fact, you can get a little bit more, understanding and put things in context a little bit better. Okay. So what we're going to look at here is some vocabulary. I am still trying to figure out specifically how I'm going to be able to assess vocabulary, because that is something that I'm going to try to do with you all as well, even though we're not in person. So if you would please click on the link that's for number 1, where it says Government Unit Vocabulary, and that should take you to a Quizlet. Again, please go to the course page, click on step 1, where it says the vocabulary, and open that up. So these words are a combination of both lists that relate to government. So this is for Standard 816 and Standard 823. And so these 15 terms relate to a combination of both. So just so you are aware. Okay. So I'm going to kind of go through these pretty quickly. You can obviously do review on your own, but we will be assessing these in some capacity. See, sometimes I can't see that. So is anybody having trouble accessing the link? Okay.
No, it seems to be working fine.
Okay. Trying to get Cassidy in our session that keeps freezing it. Cassidy, are you in? Can't see. Says they're stuck in. Okay. I think hopefully she'll try to resubmit. Okay. All right. So these 15 terms are very common terms when it comes to government. Okay. It includes the 3 branches of the U.S. government. It includes a lot of characteristics in there, but there's a few in here that are unique, that are more, specific to a certain concept. So bicameral, 2-house legislature, basically expressing that we have a Congress that's made up of 2 parts, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Okay. There we go. Then we have checks and balances. This term right here is more or less the theme for the entire second standard that we have, which is on how government works. So checks and balances, like for example, right now, they're trying to fill a vacancy in the Supreme Court. The vacancy in the Supreme Court, the president trying to makes a nomination, and then the U.S. Senate confirms or denies that appointment. That's how checks and balances work. So it's an action where at least one additional branch of government is involved, or at least 2 branches total are involved in any kind of action taken, whether it's approving a nomination for a position, whether it's approving a law. That's checks and balances. The legislative branch is all about making the laws. That's where the laws are going to be created and voted on by both parts of Congress. You need to have both houses of Congress approve a law before it moves on to the president. And then the president in that mind has 2 choices. He can approve it by signing his name to the bill and making it official, or he can veto it. A lot of people look at veto as the singular greatest power that any branch of government has, because it's not impossible for the Congress to approve the law after a veto has taken place, but it's very difficult. Does anybody know You can just raise your hand. Does anybody know what is needed in Congress to override a presidential veto? Cassidy?
Isn't it 2/3 of Congress has to agree?
That's correct. So 2/3 or roughly 66% repeating would have to approve it in the House and the Senate for the veto to be overridden. So if a law was approved or a bill was approved, which is the term before it officially becomes a law, if a bill is approved at, let's say, 52% in Congress and the president vetoes it, that means you'd have to convince more people than before to support it by increasing the vote percentage to 66% at least. And that's hard. Vetoes are not impossible, and they've happened plenty of times in history, but they're not easy to get to, okay, overriding a veto. Cabinet's a group of advisors to the president. These are appointed positions like Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury. Those are appointed positions within the cabinet. A lot of times the vice president is included in that cabinet position because he or she is an advisor, but that is not an appointed position. The vice president is elected. Judicial branch of government in charge with interpreting laws. And the reason why we know that is because with the Supreme Court would be giving an explanation why they made a decision based on something within like the Constitution. So in other words, the Supreme Court rules this as unconstitutional because it violates the First Amendment. That's interpreting the law. Federalism, division of power between the national and state governments. In our current government structure, you have the federal government, which has a certain amount of power, but the state governments still hold power. And the relationship between how those two levels work together is basically how federalism happens, okay? It's not as if the federal government has all the power or 99% of the power and then the states have hardly any. It's a pretty good balance, okay? Executive branch, enforcing the laws. So when the president signs a law into effect, that's enforcement of the law. Limited government, the idea that the power of the U.S. government is limited to what is stated in the Constitution. One of the best ways we know that is through the 10th Amendment, which says, the 10th Amendment says that all powers that are not given to the federal government are reserved to the states. So unless it's in the Constitution specifically, it's more or less an issue that the states are in charge of, okay? And a boring example that I always bring up is like speed limits in states. States would set the speed limits on highways in a state, not the federal government, okay? I know that's a very exciting example, but it's one easy to remember. Then we have unconstitutional, goes against what is stated in the Constitution, and that's usually, again, brought up in a Supreme Court case. The Senate and the House of Representatives, these are the two chambers or two parts of the Congress. The Senate has an equal number of representatives or equal number of people, 50 per state. That number never changes. So California and Wyoming or Indiana and New York have the same number of senators, 2. The House of Representatives is based on population. So the states with higher populations have more of a say or more of an influence. But remember, laws have to be approved by both the House and the Senate to be officially approved to go to the president. Okay, you can't just have one approve it. Last 3, we have the Supreme Court, the highest court of the judicial branch. That's why it's called the Supreme Court. Pretty much the only way that you're going to cancel a decision by the Supreme Court when that's made is to amend the Constitution. And then you have president and vice president, which are the 2 highest levels of the executive branch. And the one thing about the vice president that is interesting is that they're also considered to be the president of the Senate. And they preside over the Senate, especially because you have 100 members of the Senate. If you do have a 50-50 tie, which has happened before, the vice president can come in to make the vote that could be the tiebreaker. And that happened in 2017 with one of President Trump's appointments to the cabinet. I can't remember if it was Betsy DeVos or Rex Tillerson. One of his positions, one of his appointments had to actually be broken by a tie by Vice President Mike Pence. So I'm going to be giving you some kind of direction to review these from time to time. I'm still kind of setting up the way that we're going to be assessing over these. So just keep that in mind. But these are terms that you're going to see a lot of moving forward. Okay. All right. Let's go to number 2, or the next document, which is the in the home page that says Federalist versus Anti-Federalist chart. That needs to be up, please, on your screen. So right here, the one I'm highlighting, please have that up, and just have that up on your screen. You don't need to put it into Notability. If you want to, you can. Oops, too big there. Okay. So yesterday, we learned how, based on different actions and different characteristics of government, that the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution was going to be a major change in terms of the enlargement of the country's government. Okay, the easiest way that you can tell the government increases is because we're going from one branch of government under the Articles of Confederation to 3 under the U.S. Constitution. Okay, if you go again by that chart, we have an executive, legislative, and judicial under the U.S. Constitution, when we only had a legislative or a Congress under the Articles. Okay, so when James Madison proposes this new foundation for the American government through what was called the Virginia Plan, there was going to be people that liked it, but equally there was going to be people that didn't like it. Okay, and those two groups of people that are formed at this convention were Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Okay, now it's important to know a couple things here. These are not political parties. So these are not the first 2 political parties in American history. Some historians call them a faction, which is another name for an organized political group, but this does not tell us that we have specific political parties. But we're going to be going there pretty quickly, okay? But it's important to know right now that these are 2 groups. The Federalists want the new U.S. Constitution. The Anti-Federalists are fearful of the new U.S. Constitution and wonder why we can't just revise the Articles of Confederation. Okay? The Anti-Federalists admit that there's weaknesses with the Articles of Confederation, but they still believe that it's a good document. And it really comes down to the Anti-Federalists don't want state power to be diminished. Okay? Now, when this proposal for this new government is issued in September of 1787, from that point forward, these 2 groups are going to do everything in their power to convince the population of the country to side with them. And so this is when you start to see publications like the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers being published. And so this is when you start to see documents written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, representing the arguments of both sides. Okay, Hamilton was a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson was an Anti-Federalist. Okay, and so what this chart's going to do is it's going to go over some of the real specific characteristics that these 2 groups feel about these topics. So the first 2 are pretty straightforward. A constitution establishing a strong central government. The Federalists are going to be in favor of that, and the Anti-Federalists are not. Okay, and the big reason why is that if you look at the note, it says the chief worry of the Anti-Federalists was that the states would lose influence with the growth of the national government's power. Okay, so let's remember one thing. Under the Articles of Confederation, the state governments had more authority than the federal government. Okay, remember, the federal or central government is the government that's over the entire country. With the Constitution, that's going to be flipped. And so the idea is that the federal government has to have the most authority, and then the state governments do. Okay? And we've seen how when it was the other way around, there was fundamental weaknesses. No power to tax, no power to defend people and their rights, no power to enforce laws, etc. Okay? Now, when it comes to the power of the 13 states, it's going to be the opposite again. Federalists, because they favor a strong central government, are not going to also want strong state governments. You can't have both because they're going to constantly clash with each other. So the Federalists favored limited state power. Ultimately, they were going to have plenty of representation in the Congress, including the Senate, But ultimately, the authority has to be within the federal government. Now, obviously, anti-federalists are going to feel the opposite of that because they want to keep state sovereignty and power at a high level, okay? So they're fearful of this new federal government and what it could mean, all right? But really, of all the indicators on this chart, this one right here, the Bill of Rights, I can't stress enough why this is important here, okay? A Bill of Rights is not a new concept. It's not something that was invented with the U.S. Constitution. A Bill of Rights, historically, going back to ancient times in Britain, even ancient times in like the republics of Greece and Rome, is a list of rights that people have that provide protection from the government. Okay, it's a very standard concept. Now, guys like Hamilton didn't feel that the Bill of Rights were necessary because the fact is, with the government's power increasing, it would give the federal government more authority and ability to protect the rights of the citizens. But the Anti-Federalists felt that if there was an absence of a Bill of Rights in the original Constitution, it would be seen as a threat to individual liberties because there would be no guarantee in writing that the rights of the citizens would be protected. The implied understanding that it would be protected was not going to be enough for Anti-Federalists like Thomas Jefferson, okay? And this right here, folks, this is the bargaining chip. The Constitution does not get approved with the votes from the Anti-Federalists, which were needed without the Bill of Rights. So the reason why we have the Bill of Rights and the first 10 amendments to the Constitution today is because it was the compromise between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists over the issue of the new U.S. Constitution, okay? Obviously, when it comes to the Articles, the Federalists are going to be opposed to it because that's why they're proposing this new government, because they said the power was limited under the Articles for the Congress. It was limited to requesting cooperation from the states instead of expecting it, and that's obvious. Now, the Anti-Federalists say, you know, yeah, there's problems with it, but it doesn't mean that we have to abandon them altogether. Now, in these last two indicators, these are going to give you more characteristics about where and who are going to be supporting each of these groups, okay? So in theory, a guy like Hamilton is in favor of a large republic, a strong central government with the ability to function and be a country that's going to have a role in society. Okay. They were worried, you know, Hamilton was worried that we were not going to be taken seriously on the national stage without a strong central government. Okay. And so a large republic in itself was also the best way to protect the rights of individual citizens, because he says it's ineffective to try to do that under the Articles of Confederation because it's been proven to be unsuccessful and states don't have the ability to do it. Now, on the flip side, a guy like Thomas Jefferson would argue that only smaller local governments, or excuse me, small republic, and then thus giving more power to the state governments is the only way to protect citizens, because the larger, the republic, the harder it is to make sure that everybody's rights are fully being respected and protected. It's much easier to do that in a smaller setting in like a local community or a state. And then when it comes to supporters, the elites are going to be in favor of what Hamilton's proposing and what Madison's proposing here. Okay, the elite, the highly educated, those that are living in urban settings, primarily in the North, you know, big cities like Boston, big cities like New York, big cities like Philadelphia. That's where you're going to see a lot of the more urban support for the bigger government. Farmers of, large farmers, plantations, merchants, businessmen, artisans, they're going to tend to be supporters of the Federalist Party. Small farmers, rural areas, the often overlooked and undervalued members of society, the middle class, those who do not have the same voice and authority because of their socioeconomic status, are going to be those that tend to support the Anti-Federalists. Okay, and as it mentions, there was only a few exceptions where we had Anti-Federalists that were actually considered to be the elitists. Okay. Is there any questions on what we're seeing with this chart? Cassidy.
I have a question. If the majority of farmers were anti-federalists, right? Then
Correct.
were they taxed like a lot after the war? That's what caused Shays' Rebellion. So why would they support a government that they know like doesn't work?
So Shays' Rebellion precedes this government. So Shays' Rebellion came about under the Articles of Confederation, and Shays' Rebellion, as we talked about the other day, really was the big evidence that showed that the Articles were ineffective. Taxing in general is something that's going to be very unpopular in the early years of this country in general, but the difference between taxing under the Articles of Confederation and taxing under the authority of the federal government is that a guy like Hamilton believed that taxing under the authority of the federal government could actually be enforced. So even though it's going to be unpopular because the country economic, status, whether you want to call it a recession or depression, they're in a severe economic state. It is something that is going to be more, the ability to enforce those laws are going to be, and taxes are going to be much more effective with a large, strong central government to enforce decisions rather than a weak central government as we saw under the Articles. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, let's go back to the course page. And we're going to go to the last link here at the bottom under number 2. I hope everybody heard me there. And we're going to click where it says Federalist versus Anti-Federalist Assignment. And we're going to put that into Notability, please. So one of the things that both of these groups, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, had to do was they had to convince citizens of the country to side with them in their arguments about the government. Because if citizens are influential in influencing the outcome of what kind of government they're going to have, it means they're going to be in the ears of their representatives and saying, I don't want this, I want this. I don't want a small government, I want a big government, or vice versa. And that influence could be shaping the voting of the members of the Continental Congress or the Constitutional Convention. Okay. So what we have here is we have 2 documents dated the same date, June 21st, 1788. One by Melancton Smith, who's an anti-federalist, and the other by probably the most famous Federalist in history, Alexander Hamilton. And these are going to be written a little less than a year after the Constitution's actually introduced. So the Constitution was introduced, and what happened was they adjourned, and then the representatives of the states brought back copies of the Constitution to their state legislatures and to the people to begin to discuss whether or not they would support it. And this process would go over several years until they finally got the number of states needed to approve the new document. Okay. And part of the reason it took so long is because the Anti-Federalists would not support it without the Bill of Rights. Okay. But what we're going to look at here are 2 documents related to representation. Who should be represented, who should have a voice in representation, and what that looks like. And so you're going to see 2 very different polarizing statements here by Smith and by Hamilton on the issues of representation. All right. And you're going to see Hamilton referencing examples of where, major, huge democratic nations or societies like, or, empires like Greece did not survive. Okay. And you're going to see the arguments from both sides about their views on representation in terms of like government. And so when you are reviewing these excerpts, you're going to be working on completing this graphic organizer. The questions here on the left are going to be prompting you in relation to what is being said in document A and document B. Please make sure you're paying attention. So is this person happy with how the new Constitution deals with representation? You can't just put yes or no here. I would like these responses to be thorough and detailed. Did everybody hear me there? I want these responses to be thorough and detailed. I would like you to be writing in complete sentences. So if I kind of gauge that, you know, it's just like a quick 3 answer response, I may have you redo it. All right. Please also, and this is something that I would like moving forward, please create text boxes and type out your answers, because a lot of people are writing so fast, I can't read what you're writing. So I would like the responses in each of these boxes to be done as a text box. If you want to recreate this box on paper and write out your answers, that's fine. And take a picture, you can do that, but you need to recreate it very similar to this. You can print this out and write on it if you want to do it that way. All right, but I would like text boxes and not just scribbling with your finger. Okay, this is hard to read. So what kind of government would this person like to see based on what they're saying? And then it says find a quote to support your claim. I would like an actual quote in quotation marks in this box from the document, from document A and document B, that supports this question. And then based on the document, what sort of people in society would support this view? Okay. Now, if you need more guidance in helping you, especially with this last part, you can scroll down to the end and you have another box similar to the one I showed you earlier, where it breaks down characteristics of Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Now, these names like Publius and Brutus and Cato, these were how these Federalist papers and Anti-Federalist papers were signed when they were printed in newspapers, so forth. Okay, and so we didn't learn till later that Hamilton primarily, and then along with Madison and John Jay, were responsible for the Federalist papers, and then Jefferson largely responsible for the Anti-Federalist papers. But it gives you characteristics of each in terms of their overall perspective and the types of people that would be supporting that. Someone brought up an interesting point about Hamilton and his belief later on in elitism, considering that he grew up in pretty extreme poverty. So somebody thought that was interesting in one of the other classes. So just to recap here, you're going to be reading through document A and document B, perspectives from the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. And you're going to be completing the graphic organizer in complete sentences with detail. Remember, please use text boxes with typed out answers. All right. This is going to be due tomorrow. I would like these done by tomorrow. Okay. Turn in Canvas that you can turn in directly from Notability that says Federalist versus Anti-Federalist assignment. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? The last thing I'm going to talk about before we adjourn is I just want to make sure people know that when I am grading an assignment for you and I leave feedback on the assignment, that you should be able to access that. I've had a few students email me and said, hey, my assignment was marked incomplete in Skyward. I'm talking about the declaration assessment. 8.1.5 declaration assignment was marked incomplete, but I can't see your comments. You can do that 2 different ways. You can look at it through your grade book, or if you go to the actual assignment and you scroll to the bottom and you click on where it says submission, you should be able to see my comments next to that. And if you do have any specific questions, you can always send me a Canvas message and I can assist you through that, okay? All right, I will stay on here for a couple minutes if anybody has any questions about the assignment. Otherwise, you may go ahead and take off, and I will see you tomorrow at noon. Please make sure that you remember that this assignment is due tomorrow, okay? If you did not finish the exit ticket yesterday, please get that done as well, all right? Have a good day.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.